Our gospel reading this morning is from Luke chapter 7. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And a woman in the city who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and to dry them with her hair. Then she continued kissing his feet and anointing them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw it, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him, that she is a sinner." Jesus spoke up and said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." "Teacher," he replied, "speak." A certain creditor had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debts for both of them. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, "I suppose the one for whom he canceled the greater debt." And Jesus said to him, "You have judged rightly." Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little." Then he said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." But those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. You know that awkward moment when you're visiting another church and they come to the Lord's Prayer and you're praying along and you know you're coming to that part about forgiveness when you say, "And forgive us our..." Is it trespasses? Is it debts? Is it sins? What are we supposed to say in this church, right? Episcopalians usually say trespasses, and that sort of figures because back in the day, they were mostly the landed gentry. And the Presbyterians, they've always been the bankers, so they say debts. Baptists, we're just common folk, so we say sins because we're just plain old sinners. Our story today from Luke's gospel has Jesus making connection between debts and sins. And we have to look a little more closely at the story to understand. Jesus has been healing the sick and raising the dead, really, in the episodes just preceding this one in Luke's gospel. The question over and over again in each one is he a prophet? And Luke is at pains to say in each case, well, he may be that, but he's more than just a prophet. This story drives the point home as Jesus boldly declares this woman's sins forgiven. The scene is scandalous. Simon is a well-respected Pharisee who invites Jesus to his home for dinner. Jesus doesn't turn away any invitation to a meal, apparently. He has just in the verses preceding this been acknowledged that he'd been accused of eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners. Well, now he's invited by a well-respected religious leader, and this man wouldn't at all consider himself a sinner, but Jesus doesn't pass up a meal. So there they are at table. Actually, it says that, but it wouldn't have really been a table. Back in the day, the food would have been put out on the floor with cushions all around the food, and everyone at the dinner party reclining, holding their weight on their left elbow, eating with their right hand, and their legs and feet out behind them. It was the custom. Although this is a private dinner party, the house is likely open and people are crowded around on the outside looking in at the proceedings. All at once, a woman appears, clearly uninvited. A hush comes over the room. She's a woman they all know. Right? A woman of, shall we say, ill repute. She takes her place at Jesus' feet, lets her hair down, and begins to weep with such force that her tears stream down on his feet to wash his feet. And she dries his feet then with her hair and begins to pour perfume on them as an act of lavish love. This is not how the host saw the evening going. Simon thinks Jesus must not be a prophet after all, because if he were, he would have known what kind of woman this is, and he would never have allowed her to come near him, to touch him and contaminate him, make him impure. A true man of God would avoid people like that. And yet Jesus sits there and lets her do her thing. And admittedly, this would have looked bad. This woman knows how to make men pay attention to her. And she's doing just that to Jesus. Simon makes it clear she's a sinner. And that's when Jesus tells the parable of the two debtors. Now then, there's an easy way to look at this text that I'm going to suggest to you is just too easy. All right. At first blush, there was probably some literal blushing going on there, don't you know? And so we might say, well, there goes that Pharisee being a Pharisee. He's judging her the way the hypocrite Pharisees always judge. Jesus doesn't judge. He just accepts people the way they are and doesn't turn her away. And that's what we have to do in the church. We have to stop judging people and pointing out people's sins and just accept everyone as they are. But is that fair? I mean, Jesus doesn't deny she's a sinner. And the church isn't judging people just because we acknowledge that people are sinners. This is a common fallacy, suggesting that the church is either always supposed to be talking about sin or never supposed to be talking about sin. The church should care about being a holy people. We are not a permissive body where anything goes. The whole thing about not judging is a secular critique of the church by people who think we should give up talking about sin altogether and just live and let live. But the New Testament idea of not judging doesn't mean that. It means we shouldn't be looking for ways to write people off for their sins. We should be looking for ways to write people's sins off. You see? We want righteousness, but everybody has to start somewhere. And nobody ever arrives. We're all in process. We are all of us, always sinners. All of us. And that's where Jesus' parable is going to take us. But before we get there, again, let's think about who this woman is. The story makes it pretty clear her sin is sexual. She isn't the town gossip, okay? She's a harlot, and sexual sin, for some reason, is always a preoccupation among us religious people. But how did she become a harlot? Does anybody ever think about things like that? Figure she woke up one day and said to herself, you know, I really like sex. And I think I'm pretty good at it. And I could make a good living giving men what they want. Think I'll become a prostitute. Yeah, that's it. I've found my calling. In that day as in ours, most women who resort to a life of prostitution do so because they think they have no other viable options. Women in Jesus' day were either under the care of their fathers in their home or their husbands. And if for whatever reason they were kicked out of either house, they were on their own and their options were few. And most of them knew that the only way to eat would be to sell themselves. And even today, most prostitutes and porn actresses and the like do so because they have been, at some point in their lives, sexually abused and or they are runaways, and mostly they bear an enormous amount of deep shame and disgrace, and they are desperate. Do you know that the average American girl who falls into the sex trade is 13 years old? 13. She spends no more than 48 hours on the street before she is approached by a pimp who promises to take care of her in exchange for her selling herself. In an article in this month's Advocate magazine, we are told that about 400 girls are trafficking on our city streets here in Dallas every night. They're expected to bring in about $1,000 a night to their slave masters. This is a seedy and dangerous life, and stopping it has been a constant challenge for law enforcement. So recently, Jimmy Carter wrote a piece for the Washington Post proposing a change in the way we address this matter as a nation. He offers what he calls the Nordic model, which was pioneered in places like Sweden, for instance, and has had tremendous positive effects. In this model, you treat women who are caught in this web of sleaze as victims who need a hand getting out rather than as criminals who need handcuffs to be put in jail. The proven way of dealing with this goes after the men who pay for these girls and those who profit from them, in other words, the Johns and the pimps. If you like market-based solutions to problems, this makes sense. You cut the demand and the supply goes away. But we always blame the women, not the men who engage in these demeaning acts or those who treat these women like sex slaves. There's a beautiful ministry in Dallas called New Friends, New Life that is helping to rescue girls from this and give them back their sense of dignity and hope for a better tomorrow. Christians have an opportunity to address human trafficking and live up to our calling of giving good news to those who are trapped in these terrible circumstances. But back to the story. Jesus tells Simon a parable about debts. Sex and money. Sex and money. The two things, right, we associate most in the church about sin. The woman is associated with sex, but the rich male Pharisee, he would have related more to money. So Jesus asks the man whether the debtor whose great debts are forgiven or the one whose small debts were forgiven would be more grateful. The one whose debts are greatest, he replies. And of course, he's right. Notice what Jesus does. He doesn't deny that she's a sinner, but he implies that Simon is too, and that he doesn't see himself as a sinner at all. Just because his sins are less than hers in the cultural and religious understanding of the day doesn't mean she's a sinner and he isn't. It means she understands she's a sinner and he doesn't. Here's the telling question then Jesus asks Simon. Do you see this woman? No, he didn't see this woman. He sees a sinner, not a person. He sees someone messing up his dignified dinner party. He sees an embarrassing emotional fit that needs to be dealt with by whisking her away. Jesus sees her. He doesn't see her sin so much as he sees her love and her tears. Vicki Collins is an English professor at Oregon State University. At a luncheon conversation about the teaching profession, they were talking about teachers who have most influenced their life, and she told a story about a high school teacher that changed her, had a great influence on her to lead her into her vocation. She said that when she went into his class every day, it was located in a part of the building that was near a very busy thoroughfare, and the cars with the traffic would be whisking past, and often it was just loud, and every single day they'd come in and he'd begin class by complaining about the noise and about the emergency vehicles, especially with the sirens. Then one Monday, they came to class and he opened class the same way, and this time he apologized to them. He told them that over the weekend, his pregnant wife had had a medical emergency. The service that the ambulance provided saved her life and her baby's. He told his students, I want to apologize to you because I was listening to the noise instead of thinking about the lives. This is what should concern us in the church. We should be more worried about whether great sinners feel welcome here than we are about making sure lesser sinners who look more respectable and will keep up appearances feel comfortable here. Frankly, both should feel welcome, and neither should feel comfortable. If you want comfortable, join a social club. If you want to grow into the image and likeness of Jesus Christ, join a church and give up a sense of entitlement that you should be comfortable. Grace only works on sinners, And sinners of the flesh and sinners of the spirit are both sinners in need of grace. It's just that sinners like this woman seem to know they need grace, and sinners like Simon too easily forget they do too. Now, in theory, we all want women and men whom we may see as great sinners to come to church and find the Lord here, don't we? But in reality, we tend to want more Simons like us. I do. We want sinners who tacitly and quietly confess their small debts are forgiven more than we want those loud and bawdy types, whose great debts are forgiven. But if I am crucified with Christ, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. It is not about me or what I want. And look at the cost of having a church of mainly Simons. We experience too little love. Love isn't easily controlled, people. It's a bit of bother. It goes all kinds of places. It's messy. It may be tears. It may be scenes. There may be physical hugs that go on uncomfortably long, like this woman's lavish love, which, let's be clear, Jesus praised. At the end of the day, the real question is whether the church is primarily in the sin avoidance business or the sin forgiving business. Now, if you go with the former, Good luck to you seeing any great sinners like this woman showing up among us. She showed up not because Simon was there, but because Jesus was. She sensed from him the possibility that she would receive grace and forgiveness. If you go with the Jesus approach, though, get ready for your heart to be touched and for love to be touching. So, what kind of church do we really want? Amen.